Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me today on episode 3 of BCBA Tay. Today, we're going to talk about the second part of an autism diagnosis. Maybe one of these days I'll have one of those fancy intros to kind of get us started. But until I do, I'm just going to jump right in and get going, okay? So just a quick recap. Yesterday, we talked about early signs of autism. We talked about the social communication piece and what that looked like, maybe some routine and repetitive rigid behaviors. We didn't really get into the diagnostic criteria. I told you that was going to come later, and it's later. So we're going to talk about that today here in just a few minutes. I also talked about some of the recommendations that I have, like using those milestone tracker apps and things like that, just to kind of, keep your eyes on your young children, just to make sure they're meeting all their milestones. And then including some reliable sources that will give you honest feedback about your potential concerns for your kiddo and whether you should seek further guidance there. If you missed episode 2, you can find it on my YouTube channel. It's episode 2, Early Signs of ASD. And today, like I said, we're gonna pick up where we left off yesterday. So, if you observed the signs of an early signs and symptoms of autism, what do you do now? That's kind of where we're going to go today. So step 1, I would say, you're going to need a referral for a diagnostic evaluation or an autism, specifically an autism evaluation. You're going to typically get that from your doctor or pediatrician. So make sure you have a pediatrician for your kiddo. I've never heard of it being one of those things where you can kind of walk into an urgent care and say, hey, my child needs a diagnosis. So you really need a consistent doctor for your child. Some insurance companies are also requiring that your doctor has kind of documented your concerns over a couple of visits. So if you have concerns, make sure that you voice them to your doctor. You could also, if you have a patient portal, you could also type those concerns to your doctor. That way they go directly on the patient record. Not every insurance or payer is like that, but just kind of a quick note on making sure that you are communicating frequently and often about your concerns, and just making sure that those get added to the chart in case that is needed for your payer. And when I say payer, I mean either private or either commercial or private or Medicaid funded insurances, either of those. There's just so many different forms of payers and companies that for lack of a better term, pay. And so they all have different payer requirements. So you're going to probably also become a specialist in all of those things. And that's just another great way to be an advocate for your kiddo. So step 1, you obtain a referral from your doctor for an autism evaluation. Now you might be asking the next question is okay, what do I do with this referral? Who does it go to? Where do I get this done? Great question. So you need to find a place that does diagnostic evaluations for autism. And sometimes they'll do, rarely, but sometimes you'll see a full diagnostic evaluation. You don't necessarily need that right now. If your child is older, that might be recommended or even required. If your child's younger, they may not require that. And they might just say, we just need an autism screening or an autism diagnosis or evaluation. So where are places to look? Some ABA providers have their own diagnosticians and a team of diagnosticians within their centers. So you could check into those. Even if you don't think you're going to pursue ABA therapy afterwards, it's still a resource that you could look into to see how quickly you could get in and see if they meet all the requirements and what those wait lists look like. It's also a good opportunity for you to kind of pick their brain about ABA. If you have questions about that, that's something that I can cover at another point, but it's just great to kind of voice that opinion now. Psychologists will often do them either through individually, on their own in their own practice, or in other places like ABA clinics and centers. Some hospitals will do them and have them. Pediatric hospitals will probably do them. Again, the wait list there typically is a little bit longer. So you might just want to check around and see. You might even call your insurance company and say, hey, what are the requirements for an autism diagnosis to be able to receive the services that my child might need? Who would you recommend that I go to? who's within my network. Like, go ahead and call your insurance company with all those questions and just say, like, I'm going to ask for a referral from my doctor and I need to know where to go. It would also be really good for you to just know like what the requirements are from those diagnostic reports. So some of them will require a certain type of clinician to do them, whereas other states are a little bit more lax. So when I first moved to Florida, I was surprised to see that they, at that time, for their Medicaid, basically a doctor could just sign a piece of paper saying autism, and they were accepting it and paying for ABA services with just that. Now, since then, it's changed. They also we're letting OTs or BCBAs just do the ADOS assessment and then have a doctor sign off on it. And they were accepting that for an ASD diagnosis. So just make sure that you know what your current payer requirements are. And what I would hate for you to go through the entire process and have a diagnostic evaluation done just to find out it's not what you need for the services that you're looking for. So just make sure that you're familiar with those. Some of the other things that I'll just take a minute here to explain is that your child might have a school diagnosis that does not translate to a medical diagnosis. So the school will do their own assessment. They will have their own psychologist conduct an assessment for that child. That school diagnosis cannot provide you medical services, just like a medical diagnostic report cannot provide you services in the schools, or at least not that I've seen so far. I've worked in 3 different states. And have my hands in the pot for several different other states right now. And I haven't heard of that being a thing. It's not to say it's impossible, but the schools that I've been familiar with so far, they must do their own in-house testing and assessments. That might be a little bit different for like private schools, charter schools, things like that. But at least the public schools that I'm familiar with have to do their own testing. So just a little note about that. You'll have to go through the process for both the school and medically. Today, I'm mostly talking about a medical diagnosis and what that might look like. The school will require a diagnostic report before you can get a 504 plan or before they can attach the autism diagnosis to that 504 plan or the IEP. Now, I am not an expert on those things, so at some point I will surely bring in an expert and they can tell you all about those things. I know just the very top of that, just the very surface. So, like I said, I'll bring in an expert here later that can give you all the details on those things. Okay, so you got the referral from your doctor. You've found the place to get your diagnostic evaluation. Your next step is then to request an insurance authorization for the DX. Now, whichever provider you're going to should handle all of that for you. You might just need to call, check in, say, hey, what's the status? Have you requested that? Have you heard back from the insurance company? Again, if you do the legwork and kind of check to see that, make sure that they're in network and that they're going to do all the things that you need them to do, you can sometimes cut down on some of that wait list. But you've already gotten this far. It'd be a shame for you to wait months and months and months just to get insurance authorizations or whatever. So I would stay on top of that. I would call and say, hey, have you heard anything? Do we have approval? Are we ready to schedule this? I would call pretty frequently and ask about that. Because you need to get in, you need to get on that schedule. The next thing is to get it scheduled. And I would say, is there a cancellation list? If it's a long wait list of a couple of months, I would say, do you guys have like a cancellation list that I could be a part of? Is my authorization for the DX going to be active when you're doing the diagnostic evaluation? Again, your provider should be checking all of that for you. So typically, an insurance company will say, yep, you are approved to do a diagnostic evaluation so long as it falls within this 3-month period. So if your diagnostic evaluation gets scheduled 6 months out, then you might just want to double check and say, so are you going to extend that authorization? Or are you going to call the insurance to take care of that, just to make sure that you don't get stuck with a big bill? So it's scheduled. I would also ask, how long is this appointment going to be? How long can I expect to be there on site? How long can I expect to be in the actual appointment with this diagnostician? I would probably also ask, what can I fill out ahead of time? What I have seen as stressful as it can be to just get your child to the session, It's even more stressful if you're trying to do the session and you're filling out patient paperwork, you're filling out social histories, you're trying to do all these other assessments when you maybe could have done them after you put kiddo to bed, or when you're not in this strange place trying to keep an eye on your child. So I would ask and say, what can I do ahead of time? Can I fill out any of this stuff online? Can I come in, pick it up, bring it in the day of, and drop it off to you fully filled out? I would specifically say, what can I do ahead of time to make this assessment go a little bit easier? I would also say, what's going to be required of me? Who needs to be there for the assessment? Is one caregiver enough? Do we need both caregivers? When I was doing evaluations for intake for ABA, I would sometimes have parents come in, or not parents, I would sometimes have the kiddo come in, and a non-primary caregiver would bring the child to the assessment. So you just need to clarify if that's a potential for you. You can't make the diagnostic appointment, so you need aunt or uncle to bring them in. I would just call and confirm that that's going to be okay. Again, because if you have to reschedule that appointment, you could be looking at a couple of months. So just a couple of tips as you're going to schedule these appointments. Okay, so you've done your pre-assessments. You've asked how long it's going to be. You've completed any of the paperwork that you can ahead of time. Now it's time for the evaluation. So you go into the evaluation. They're going to call you into the room. They're likely going to run a few assessments. Not to say that they have to, but they're likely to run at least a couple of them. Some of them can be administered online prior to you coming in, like the Vineland can be done ahead of time. And they're probably going to do at least one observation and potentially one interview with you while you're there. So some of these tests that are common to see are the ADOS. I mentioned this in episode 2, or maybe the introduction. I can't remember. I've ran a couple of ADOSs. They take about an hour to an hour and a half, and it's really like the implementer interacting with the child to see how they respond to different situations. That's the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. They might also do the ADIR. That's the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised Version. So it is what it sounds like. It's an interview-based assessment, but that one's often used. Then there's the GARS and the CARS. So the GARS is the Gillum Autism Rating Scale, and the CARS is the Childhood Autism Rating Scale. Then there's different intellectual tests that they might run. Again, this will typically all be done within the same setting, which is why I'm saying you should probably ask how long you're going to be there to know snacks, diapers, wipes, extra outfits, those kinds of things. If you need to bring a support person to kind of help you, it could be a very long assessment. So I would just ask these things ahead of time so that you're prepared. They might also do a Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales assessment. This one is not specific to autism. It can be used for quite a few other things, but it's typically we can just send it to you and you fill it out over email. If you have to do it in person, it's pretty lengthy. It's a lot of words. It takes a little bit of time to get through, especially if you have a little kiddo that is running through the room, throwing things, not happy to be there or very happy to be there. It can be a little tricky. So again, that's why I was saying, which assessments can I do ahead of time? Yes, please. Let me get those done before I go. Okay, following that. So they've done whatever assessments they're going to do. Some diagnosticians will tell you right then. Maybe they'll say, I've been able to score them. These are the scores and the results. Some diagnosticians might say, I need to score them, review them, and then I'll call you, but here are my indications. This is likely what I'm going to have confirmed. It kind of just depends on their level of comfortability with the scores, the time that it took. For me, also, it's been a little bit of, Mom, you seem done with the day. We've really struggled to get kind of through the assessments. The last thing I want to do right now is kind of weigh you down more with keeping you here longer and trying to keep the kiddo in this space. So sometimes I will just, there's been a few times where I've said, I'll call you. When would be a good time for me to call you? We can kind of go over this when she's not, mom or dad or grandma or whoever is not trying to take care of serious challenging behavior that's going on while I'm trying to have a conversation with them. So that's also potentially an option, depending on, like I said, which clinician that you are working with. Then will come the recommendation for services. We're going to capture that in a whole other podcast, a whole nother episode. There's just a lot to unpack there, and I'd like to have a couple of other professionals kind of come in and give their advice there as well. So what I'm going to do now is actually break down the autism diagnosis. I'll go over a little bit of the history and then go into how we get a diagnosis, how it's changed over the last 10 years, or it changed, I guess, 10 years ago, almost exactly. And then go into how to interpret that diagnosis and all the criteria. So here we go. So this is in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. It's put out every so often by the American Psychiatric Associations, and it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So this is the DSM, and this is number 5. When I started in the field, we were in DSM-4, so the 4th edition, and I think it was like the 3rd revision, or I don't know, 2 or 3 revisions at that point. And then we would see autism codes that were like 299.0 or 299.90 or 0.80. And so these were accompanied with a specific diagnostic label that a child on the spectrum might receive. So, for example, there was autistic disorder, there was Asperger's. This is where the term Asperger's has come from, is that DSM-4. There might have been childhood disintegrative disorder. I always say that wrong. And then there was this catch-all that said pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So then you would get like a specific, this is what it is, and it's on the spectrum, yes, but like this is exactly what it is. When the DSM-5 came out on May 18th, 2013, so now it's 10 years old. DSM-5 came out, they changed the code. Now it's F84. I don't know how we went from 299 to F84. I probably should know that, but I don't. And then we're also giving a level of severity or the type of support needed based on this child's deficits or their level of severity with their symptoms. So now we're just going to kind of go in and break these down. So excuse my reading. This is a lot of information, but I want to give you quotes and then we'll break them down together. So to meet diagnostic criteria for ASD, according to the DSM-5, a child may have persistent deficits in each of 3 areas of social communication and interaction. So there's going to be 3 areas that we're going to go through. The first one is social communication and interaction. The child must have deficits in all 3 of the A sections. Okay, so in each one of these A sections I'm going to go through, they have to display deficits in those. Plus at least 2 of 4 types of restricted repetitive behaviors. So that's section B. We'll read through those requirements. And then there's also a section C that they have to meet the requirements for. For B and C, they're going to ask for a level of severity. Okay. So for section A, this is where they have to have all 3 of them. This is the category, and then I'll go through the 3 different examples listed. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by the following currently or by history. Okay, and these are like illustrative. They're not necessarily exhaustive. So like they're going to give a couple of examples, but they're not saying it has to be these exact things, just similar. So again, remember that I'm going to read through all 3 of them. We'll go down and break them out, but they have to be prevalent in all of these. The first one is deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. There's a lot there, so let's unpack it. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach. We talked about yesterday, I talked about some of the early signs was a lack of eye contact, or maybe just a decrease or a difference in eye contact from other children. So these kiddos are not typically starting interactions with others. I also talked about being on the playground and how a neurotypical child will kind of show up and be like, who's going to be my BFF today? our children with autism are likely not going to do that because of this specific deficit. So this is where they're not looking for those social interactions with other people. Now, if they need something, that's a different story, but they're not just looking to look for social interaction. Failure to have normal back and forth conversation. Again, I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with someone with autism. I hope to have Adam, my brother, here on an episode coming up, but he has learned how to have back and forth conversations. But even then, you'll see some of these examples, but it's difficult to give this like give and take in a conversation. So this is a skill that we often teach in ABA. This is a skill where you might say, "Hey, I watched a movie last night." And if a neurotypical person might say, "Yeah, what'd you watch?" And a child with autism might just be like, "Okay." Or they might just go off and start telling you about their special interests. So we would say, I think they want you to say, "What'd you watch?" And so they'll say, "What'd you watch?" And I'll say, "Oh, I watched The Lion King with my kids." And they might say, "Okay." So there's like, and I love having these conversations. I think they are often so true to how people might often just naturally be thinking about things. Like, good for you, you've watched The Lion King. But to have really meaningful relationships with people as you get older, you need to have some level of back and forth conversation and reciprocal conversation skills. And so that's what this is talking about here. Being able to have a normal back and forth conversation. A reduced shared of interests. Sometimes a kiddo we're trying to teach them to have a conversation about things that are not a special interest for them. So this kid might be heavily interested in the planets. And so they want to talk about the planets. And then I'll say, "Okay, you get to talk about what you want to talk about for 2 minutes. And then we're going to talk about something I want to talk about for 2 minutes." So they'll talk about their planets. And then I'll say, "Okay, it's my turn. I want to talk about whatever." And maybe it's like ecosystems or something that they might find somewhat interesting, but is outside of their special interest. And so I will start talking about those things, and this kid is just completely disinterested. They don't have the questions to say. It's again kind of that like, "Okay, cool." There's no like follow-up questions like, "What's an ecosystem?" or like, "Oh, where would I find that one?" It's just a stop in the conversation. Emotions or affect. So a reduced sharing of emotions or affect. Again, this is where somebody with autism, they might see you crying and they might say something like, "You're crying." And they may not have like the affect to show like, "Oh, are you upset? I'm sorry. Why are you crying?" And it's not necessarily that they may not feel empathy, but there's a difference there in how they're showing the empathy. Initiate or respond to social interactions. So there's a failure there to initiate or respond to social interactions. A lot of times we'll say, "Hey, hi, good morning," and either for a lack of overall communication skills or just a lack of social skills, kids will often just look at us. And when we teach them to wave, it's like this. They're waving back at us like this because they're like, "I know you want me to put my hand up and to wave. Okay, I'm doing it." But then we, teach to turn around. There's a lot of feedback in the community of like, "Why are you teaching us to do these things? Do we really need to be able to do these things?" I think that's a really good conversation to have. I think we need to be really, really purposeful about what skills we're taking up our time to teach, what skills might be aversive. When I first came into the field, we focused a lot on eye contact, which is in this next little section. And now I think we've had a lot of feedback from adults on the spectrum that are saying, "We don't want to make eye contact with you. Stop forcing us to make eye contact." And I'll just say, "I hear you. Like, I don't need you to make eye contact with me. It's okay." But I do think we need to teach them to direct and kind of check in with people that we're communicating with. That way they know that we're kind of talking to them, right? Got a little bit off. We're going to get back on track here. Number 2 in that same category, deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication. I hear often a lot of people saying, "Oh, they're nonverbal." Um, yeah, they might. The more clinically appropriate term is probably nonvocal, but the DSM does say nonverbal. And what we mean by that is they're not communicating their wants and needs. Um, Particularly, it's poorly integrated. Okay, so again, these kids might have no words. They might have 2 to 3. They might have a maximum of 10. Often, it is very often that I would have a 2 or 3 year old come in and they would have no words, no words at all at 2, 3, or 4. That's what we mean here. It could also mean they speak in one word utterances and now they're 7 or 8 and they only speak in one word utterances. Puzzles, candy, drink, water, play, jump outside. And that's the extent of their social communication. The next piece here is 2 abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures. There's the eye contact that we've been talking about. Body language, same thing. Lots of positioning away. We naturally, when we talk to people, probably kind of open up to them. We might like cross our arms a little bit, and you're going to be able to read some of that body language. It's just poorly integrated often with our individuals with autism, or especially our children, young autism. And understanding use of gestures. So pretty quickly, I would say your toddlers are probably learning thumbs up, like, hey, this is good, this is bad. The toddlers learn the middle finger sometimes if they've seen that. Surely, definitely younger childhood, they start to pick up on that. Just different gestures like stop, things like this. These are all things that we have to teach in ABA. So that they understand these like non-vocal communication forms. Just in the natural environment, simple like come here. These are just gestures that we use all the time that we don't even think about using. So if your child doesn't even understand these gestures, then that can be really, really difficult to communicate with them. To a total lack of facial expression and nonverbal communication. Oftentimes, we talked about yesterday, one of the early signs is like lack of smiling. This is kind of what it's referring to here, this lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. So your child's not only they don't understand gestures as far as you giving it to them, they're not using gestures either. So we talked about them not pointing. So they're probably not pointing. They're probably also not gesturing you to things. That's why they're pulling you. That's why they're going to grab you and actually pulling you to things, because they don't have that joint attention skill. Here, I'll just bring you. You are the tool. Come with me, and I will use you to get what I need, because of these deficits in communication. This third section down here of this one is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, to difficulty in sharing imaginative play or in making friends. So, and it can be really difficult as kiddos get older. Like my brother, he will say, I don't want to make you mad. Or he'll say, it would not be appropriate to XYZ. And to which we're like, you're right. That would not be appropriate to do right now. And sometimes he does it anyway. Or sometimes he does it and has no idea that it would have been inappropriate. And those times are usually pretty laughable. Sometimes. Other times not. But one example I can tell you about is that, just a quick example, we just went on family vacation. Our whole church family was going out to lunch. I think it was like Applebee's or something. And so we're there with like the pastor and, all these people. And there's at this long table. And they asked to pray. And Adam says he's going to pray. And we love it when Adam prays, except we never know what Adam's going to say. So some family secrets come out when Adam's praying. So he prays and he's like, before the meal, my brother asked Mom if he could get a Sprite today, because that was like his favorite drink. And Mom was like, no, we just went on vacation. We just spent a lot of money on like doing all these other things. We went out to eat a lot. Just drink water today. So he prays and he tells the whole table that we don't have any money because we just went on vacation. And so we can't have a Sprite. Those are the various social contexts that I'm talking about. And I still remember our church family was so supportive. They passed around a bread basket for us And I mean, it was such a lighthearted thing in the moment. And we still laugh about that. But it's just a really specific example of like social context and things that happen. Other things you might see is like children might disrobe in a certain space that's public where it's not socially appropriate to be doing so, just things like that, right? Difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends. We kind of talked about that a little bit yesterday. Imaginative play is very difficult. It's not black and white. It's creative. It's off script usually. Or you might see what you think is imaginative play, but it is actually scripting. So they're acting out a very specific scene that they've seen with specific things. Sometimes they'll want you to play a very specific part in that. We call that man compliance. And so it's not really imaginative. They are kind of imagining it, but it's not spontaneous or original, I guess. It's something that they've seen and they're acting it out from there. To absence of interest in peers. That's another big one. So when we would teach social group skills, I might say, okay, well, ask so-and-so what their favorite video game is. And they would say, I already know, and I don't care. I don't like that game. Okay, I hear you. It's very difficult to show interest in somebody else's interest. But they're oftentimes very just like, I don't care. I don't care to know about that. And so there's just an absence there. So in the diagnostic criteria, they're saying that there should be a deficit, or there has to be a deficit in all three of those different areas that we just went through. So again, I'm going to reiterate, just because you have one or two of these like simple symptoms does not mean that you necessarily have autism or that this child has autism. It requires deficits in all three of these in all contexts. So if your child is only struggling with these things in preschool, but outside of that they do fine, is that really what's going on? Or if they just struggle with it at school and not outside of that, that's really where you need to kind of dive in and figure out more information. Let's talk about this being in all contexts. We're going to make it through this, I promise. I'm going to stay on track. So the next section, you have to specify current severity for this next section. So severity is based on social communication impairments and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior. So now we're going to get into these levels. So for a level 3, if they're indicated a level 3, this is where this individual is requiring very substantial support. Sometimes you might hear this communicated as like profound autism if they have a few level 3s identified. So requires very substantial support. A level 2 requires substantial support, and level 1 requires support. So just remember that they have to have 2 of the 4 from this. So B, this is our next little section here. Restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least 2 of the following currently or by history. And again, these are some examples. They're not exhaustive. So the first one here is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. Some of the examples that they gave here were like simple motor. I can't talk tonight. This is going to be a struggle on a podcast. Simple motor stereotypies. So the rocking back and forth, sometimes the flapping, things like that. So you're going to see some simple, the bursts of energy or the pacing. That's what we're talking about here. Lining up toys, which I talked about yesterday. They're very meticulous. They'll get down, look at it from every angle, make sure that they're lined up. Flipping objects. This is a big one. Sometimes they'll set things up just to watch them fall, or sometimes they will just flip constantly. The new thing is they like to watch videos of other people doing them. And there's like these flipping video like contests, like, oh, I'm going to flip the water bottle and make it land, or do these like trick shots. And so I think it's really cool to kind of see how some of this has morphed over the years, whereas 10 years ago, they were doing their own flipping of objects. And now they're like, whoa, these people are really good at flipping. I'm going to watch them on YouTube Kids or something like that. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, how this has kind of changed over the last 10 years and access to technology has changed. One of the other things here is echolalia. So, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? They just repeat. So it seems like they're very vocal and communicative, but they're really just echoing the last thing that you said to them. What do you want to eat? Eat. They'll just echo the last couple of words that you want to say or that they're hearing. Idiosyncratic phrases. that can vary. Sometimes it's scripted responses. So, for example, a child sitting at the table and they're working on something and they'll say, "Good job." That means they're done. They want you to be done. They want you to say, "Good job." And so they're kind of plugging in that phrase that they've heard before. Just things like that. Phrases that have been learned in other situations. Now they're reusing them, kind of making them fit into different things, overgeneralizing the use of the word, those kinds of examples. Number 2, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So my personal example of this is that my brother will kind of decide what time he thinks he should eat dinner, and it'll be very specific. And oftentimes he doesn't tell the cooker of the food what time that is. So, for example, he might say to himself that he needs to be eating dinner at 5:47. So he'll come out, and at 5:30, he's asking mom what we're having for dinner. That's a lie. He's asking her way earlier in the day. But he might come out at 5:30 and say, "Are you going to get started on dinner?" And we used to say, a long time ago, used to say, "Yeah, I'll get started on it." And now our question is kind of morphed into, "What time are you planning on eating dinner?" And we're going to see if we can make it happen. We're going to do our very best to see if we can make that happen. And sometimes we might have to say, "Sorry, we don't have all the ingredients. They won't be here yet." And if he has a hard time dealing with that, then we're going to have to kind of work through that. But sometimes life happens, things happen. You might go to a restaurant and there's a longer wait than you expected, or the food takes longer. It's very difficult to plan exactly what time you're going to eat dinner. But if he's making himself his own food, boy, you better not be using the toaster oven. It better be like on time. He knows exactly when to put it in the oven, how long it's going to take to cook, to get it out, so he can eat at these times. One night it might be 5:47. The next night it might be 6:03. So this is what I'm talking about. There's an inflexible adherence to routines. Sometimes we've tried a lot of different techniques, but at one point we bought him like a planner, and I was just kind of curious to see like how far in advance he would plan things. It's months in advance. We'll drop things on the calendar. And the problem with that was then he was still not sharing the planner with caregivers, my parents or his dad and stepmom. And so we've kind of had to work through some of these different things over the years. There's a real like inflexible adherence to routines. Also, sometimes once you do it the first time, then he believes that you should do it every single time. For example, it's pumpkin pie, pumpkin spice season. He is always talking about pumpkin pancakes and pumpkin this and pumpkin that. He is 40 some years old, and we found out the other day that he doesn't actually like pumpkin. He literally has asked people for pumpkin pie, pumpkin pancakes, pumpkin whipped cream. Every time there's something pumpkin, he's pointing it out. He doesn't actually like pumpkin flavored things. It's because this is what you eat in the fall. You eat pumpkin flavored things. And so that's why he eats the pumpkin things, even though he doesn't really like them. So just things like that. Because it's fall, we eat pumpkin flavored things, even if we don't like them. So these are the examples I'm talking about here. Ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So they might routinely say certain things at certain times. I could give you lots of examples for this, but for sake of time, I'm going to move on. Some of the examples here: extreme distress at small changes. Yes, I see that all the time. Difficulties with transitions. Yes, this is where a lot of behavioral concerns come in with children and just individuals with autism in general. Rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals. This one's funny. You're going to hear about Adam a lot. And again, you're going to meet him, I promise. But his rigid greeting rituals, if it's just me coming over, he'll greet me as soon as he sees me. If my husband is maybe like parking the car, getting things out of the car, outside talking to my dad or whoever, he'll come in and I'll say, "Hey, bub." And I'll get like maybe a head nod. He might say, "Sis," something like that. And then I'm like, "Okay." And I used to think, he just must not be talking that much today. Okay, no problem. So I walk away. And then my husband will come in and he'll say, "Joel Thomas, how you doing?" And he'll go over and kind of address him aggressively and formally. And then after he does that, he'll come over and he'll say, "Hey, sis, how are you?" "Hi, sis. It's good to see you," or "Sis Thomas," or, he'll call me different things. And so this is what I mean. Or the other thing is he will rename people. So if their name is Chuck, he might call you Charles. If your name is Charles, he might call you Chuck. And so when he's reading Bible verses, it can get really funny. It's Matt instead of Matthew, things like that. He just is renaming these people. And that's his greeting rituals. There's a lot more of them. I'm sure we'll get to some more of them, but that's what I mean. Trying to give you guys some real life examples here. Need to take the same routine or eat the same food every day. I talked about food. We're talking about like there's a Chick-fil-A nugget and that's it. Like we're drawing the line at Chick-fil-A. McDonald's is not good enough. We cannot make, we're like the dinosaur shapes. There's two different brands out there. One of them is okay. The other one is not okay. That's what I'm talking about. The next area here, highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. So, for example, a strong attachment to or a preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or perseverative interests. I talked about the solar systems earlier. That's a big one. Minecraft, big one. Titanic is a big one. The alphabet with the younger learners that I'm working with, the alphabet, doorknobs, letters, specific like Cocomelon. Sometimes it's like a certain era of something. So like the Ninja Turtles, but the 1990s version, not the 1980s. They were too ugly. Not the current ones. They're way too trendy. Like the 1990s version of the Ninja Turtles. Things like that that are very, very specific. For some kiddos, it's like Caillou or something like that, and they just stick to it. And once it's stuck, it's pretty stuck for quite a while. I'm talking usually years. Sometimes you'll have a kiddo who will kind of exchange these every once in a while. For my brother, it's music or food. Always has been. There's a couple of other small interests, but like special interest is music. He listens to it all day, every day. He can tell you every rock band. And it's usually like 80s, 70s, and 80s rock music. I can tell you the drummers, the name of the albums, the songs, the album covers. If they played in other bands, like he just knows all of it. And that's kind of his special interest. Number 4, hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Here are the examples, then we'll unpack it. Apparent indifference to pain or temperature, adverse responses to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascination with lights or movements. Man, I could go on for this like number 4 forever. I promise I won't. Hyper or hyposensory input. It's rare that we have a kid who's like, oh, they're super sensory seeking or super sensory avoidant. Usually it's like a pendulum. They're like swinging one way and then the other one. Every once in a while we have a kid where it's like, yes, they need like this high impact all the time. They're jumping off of high things. They're running into walls. They're smelling people's feet. They are, doing some of these things and they're very sensory seeking. They're looking for these things. And so we will look for how to get them more access to these things more appropriately. We can't walk up to strangers and smell their feet, things like that. Or they might be really avoidant. The headphones on kiddos, there's a lot to be said about that right now, but I think if the kiddo wants it and it helps them and they're okay with them, great. Yes, it might draw them out, point them out in a crowd. If it helps them and they're okay, good for them. I'm glad it's helping. I get a little overstimulated sometimes too out in public or in my house with my kids. They're very loud. And I wish I had some noise canceling headphones, but I can't imagine processing all of that without language and without some other tolerance skills, being a child with autism or an individual. Pain, temperature, things like that. A lot of them don't understand proper clothing for the weather, or it seems to people that they don't feel it. I don't necessarily know that I believe that. I think that might be the case for some individuals. I tend to think that maybe they can't label it or acknowledge it, that kind of thing, but I certainly think that they feel it. So I'll stop there on that one. There's lots of examples of those things there, but they need 2 of the 4 to meet the criteria for that. The next section, specify current severity of these 2. So you're talking about that level 3 requiring very substantial, level 2 requiring substantial, and level 1 requiring support. So severity is based on social communication impairments and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior. So these are like overall criteria. So symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies later in life. That's kind of what I was talking about when my brother might say, it's probably not appropriate to XYZ. That's a learned strategy, right? The other important thing here is to say that this doesn't just happen at age 10. They weren't typically developing until 10, and then something happened that drastically changed a brain tumor, an injury, an accident, things like that. And then suddenly they had autistic symptoms. That's not what we're talking about. It's been there from the beginning, right? It may not have been fully developed, but like at age 1, we saw this. At age 2, we saw this. At age 3, we saw this. We thought maybe it was ADHD. We thought maybe it was developmental delay. We thought it was a speech delay, things like that. But these symptoms have been there. The next criteria: symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. There's a really big push for like, I don't want my child labeled. I hear you. I get that. I totally get that. My question would be, why are you pursuing a diagnosis? Or why do you think you need to pursue a diagnosis? Is it because, if it's because your child needs support, they need services, then that's going to be a decision that you're going to have to come to. But we're talking about these being clinically significant impairments that's causing them to maybe not have access to things socially, occupationally, or other important areas of current functioning. Then lastly, these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability, or like a developmental disorder or global developmental delay. And you might say, my child also has that. That's possible. But if everything can't be explained by that, then that's where we're looking at like an additional autism diagnosis. Intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder. Currently, if I would have kept reading, I would have just known this was already here for you. To make comorbid diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability, social communication should be below the expected for general development level. Again, there's a difference between global developmental delay and the social communication pieces that we're talking about, and that's what they're referring to here. Okay, so now they also require that you have to specify if it's with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, or with accompanying language impairment. And then they want to know about that. They want to know if there's associated with another neurological, mental, or behavioral disorder. That's pretty standard. They want to know what other diagnoses are involved. So now you have, did you meet the criteria of A, those persistent social communications in each of the 3 areas? If yes, then you've met that half of the criteria. If you come down here to severity, for the restricted repetitive, did they have at least 2 of those 4? And what was the severity? Level 3, 2, or 1? 3 being the highest level of support. And then you come down to severity based on social communication impairments and restriction. So the symptoms, how invasive are they? How impactful are they? Have they been present? The disturbances are not better explained by something else. And what's the level there? 1, 2, or 3? So then you should have, on your diagnostic report, you should have the criteria that were met, and then a level for section B and a level for section C. Based off of those reports, then, your diagnostician is likely to give you recommendations for what they would say is next. So, for example, if they met the criteria for the top section, but maybe it was only a level 1 for section B and C, then they might say we would recommend like early Head Start, kind of like first steps, speech therapy, occupational therapy potentially. Like they just need some support. Whereas likely if you have 3s on both of those and you have a younger child, the recommendation is likely going to be ABA. There's other recommendations, of course, absolutely. But if we're looking at requiring very substantial support, then a highly and often recommended treatment for that is ABA therapy. And so that will often be one of the recommendations on your diagnostic report. I definitely did not think I could talk about this for 50 minutes, but here we are. We're at 49 minutes. I should have known. I could talk about autism and ABA and people with autism all day, every day. So thanks for listening. If you made it this long, I hope that this was helpful. I hope that if you have gone over a diagnostic evaluation, if you've read over a diagnostic report, if you are loving somebody with autism, I hope this was helpful in understanding the diagnosis, how they got that diagnosis, or if you're pursuing this, that you understand a little bit better about what that process might look like and some of the tips to kind of help you through it. If you have other thoughts or questions, please drop them. I would love to talk about it clearly. I love talking about all of this. If I can be of any sort of help, I'm happy to. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed episode 3, and make sure that you click and subscribe so you can see when I start uploading other podcasts and series as well. Thanks so much. Bye.